handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Hey there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Denise Simon Experience. And for those of you that are with us in the first segment, thanks for hanging with us. I've tapped Ira Mehlman on the shoulder. He's the media director for Federation for American Immigration Reform, who I would say is an organization that is just doing some remarkable work trying to get some kind of reform going. And I think people get it, but it's a matter of having people all come to agree on a priority. So anyway, Ira's been kind enough to join us. And Ira, thanks for the constant, limitless, energy-bound work that you guys are doing over there at FAIR.
Well, thanks. We try our best.
Ooh, baby. We obviously are in a crisis here of where we're going to house these people. And then we're going to, we got to do something with these kids, and we got these protests. And I would argue, interestingly enough, I'm watching protests going on over in Britain too, and fundamentally their protests are the same basis as ours. It's all on immigration. Anyway, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's just a part of Department of Health and Human Services. It's kind of little known. There's some big money that has gone through that particular department over at HHS. And where it goes after it leaves Office of Refugee Resettlement is kind of in a black hole, isn't it?
Well, it is. Look, the Office of Refugee Resettlement does not have facilities to put everybody that's coming across the border who needs to be detained. And so they contract with a lot of private companies and also with nonprofit organizations. All of these entities get paid by the government to house and feed the people that are being detained. So it is becoming a rather large business, and obviously if there's money flowing, somebody's got a vested interest in keeping it going. But, just getting back to your original point here, which is that this is a worldwide crisis, and our refugee and asylum policies were never meant to deal with these sorts of situations. Our refugee and asylum processes were established during the Cold War era, when primarily political oppression was at the hands of totalitarian governments, and in the case of the Soviet bloc, people who couldn't get out because they were behind the Iron Curtain. Now what we have is a situation where you have people fleeing failed states. It's not so much that the governments are persecuting people. It's just government neglect, government incompetence, rampant crime, grinding poverty. All of these things are understandable. If we were living in those situations, we'd want to get away also. But when you start to extend political asylum and refugee status to people who just live in failed states, you are opening the door to hundreds of millions, potentially billions of people around the world who live in states that have failed or are in the process of failing.
Let's go back to John Kerry at the State Department a few years ago, because he did say, and interestingly enough, he wasn't, and I didn't agree with much of anything that he said. Two things he said. One is that he finally admitted that we have a Christian genocide going on, but nonetheless, he didn't do anything about it. The other component is that the reason we have all of these people joining Islamic State is because of an economic situation. They need a job. So if we give them a job, then we can. So it's in probably an ineloquent way that he was putting it, because we have more failed countries today than we did 100 years ago in the Ellis Island world, right?
Yes, we're 7.5 billion people, and God knows how many of them are living in countries that just absolutely are destitute. These are issues that we're going to have to deal with, but we're going to have to deal with them diplomatically, not by trying to resettle everybody from those countries in the United States or Western Europe. We can start treating these governments the same way that we treat the government of North Korea or Iran. If you're neglecting your basic responsibilities of sovereignty and expecting everybody else to kind of clean up your mess, you can't be allowed to do that for very long. We've got to hold them accountable and start making them feel some pain because they're basically walking away from the problem and saying, "Here, it's your problem now."
Well, are we adding, if we take that hard line, and I agree with you, but let's kind of do the devil's advocate side. If we take the hard line, are we adding hurt upon hurt?
Well, I mean, look, I mean, if there was an easy, happy solution to this.
I'm sorry, I had to put it out there.
Yeah, I mean, if we could wave a magic wand and, fix all these countries, we would have done it by now, but obviously we cannot do that. But, governments do respond to pressure. We've seen when you turn up the heat on them, if you start sanctioning them, if you start freezing bank accounts of some of the leaders who have looted the treasuries, that tends to get their attention. Even under the best of circumstances, these aren't going to be great countries to live in, but they could be doing better than they are if you had governments that were attentive to the interests and needs of their people. You wouldn't have gangs controlling large portions of some countries if the governments were actually doing their jobs.
Now, I'm going to throw devil's advocate again because it's a piece of it that has me fretful, and that is the United States necessarily goes, okay, Honduras, this is or Mexico or whatever. This is our hardline stance that we're going to take, and we're going to sanction and we're going to punish and blah blah blah. And in a lot of cases, rightly so. But then you have a rogue nation, Russia, China, Iran, that steps in and goes, oh, well, if they're going to leave, then we'll step in, and then they will come under their influence, and then it makes conditions worse. Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah. I mean, It certainly does present some other difficulties. Look, I mean, as I said, there is no easy or completely happy solution. We sort of have this expectation that for every problem there is a happy solution if we just work hard enough. And quite frankly, there isn't. What we need to do is to encourage reform from within these countries.
Sure.
If all the people who are picking up and leaving these countries actually stayed and confronted these governments that have been neglecting their interests, there might be some change. We saw that happen. We saw that happen in Eastern Europe. Communism was overthrown from within. You finally had people in places like Czechoslovakia, Poland, that said, you know what, this is enough. We're not going to take this anymore, and they affected real change. But if you're going to allow people to pick up and leave those countries en masse, then there's no pressure to change from within, and that's something we've got to consider.
And so we have a lot of moving parts here. We've got the State Department, we've got USAID, you got things like the Millennium Challenge, the Merit Initiative, the United Nations, and then all these non-government agencies. So beyond Health and Human Services and beyond the Office of Refugee Resettlement and Health and Human Services, Ira, have we even come up with a real dollar here on what we're throwing at this? I mean, I'm looking at a budget here that Health and Human Services, 31% of the dollars in that department at HHS goes to needy families. 18% goes to permanent and foster care. 3% goes social services. 8% child support and enforcement. 10% child care development fund. I mean, 16% to Head Start, which I always thought was a failed program anyway. Jeez, Ira, we're in the tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars, right?
Well, what we're hearing now is that the cost of housing these unaccompanied minors, the kids who show up, or not necessarily kids, they could be in their mid to late teens and still qualify as minors, but it's costing us about $1 billion a year. And, there are two things that need to change here. First of all, we have a law that says that any minor who is not from Mexico or Canada who shows up at our border has to be treated as though he or she is a trafficking victim. And so, they're entitled to a long procedure to claim, why they can come into the United States. And, that can take years sometimes. The second thing is we have a court decision that was agreed to by the Obama administration that says you cannot detain families who have minor children for more than 20 days. 20 days is just a woefully insufficient amount of time to make a determination about somebody's claim. And so, you have a situation here where essentially kids have been used as get-out-of-jail-free cards. And now you have these families coming together, and this administration has said, okay, if we can't detain them for more than 20 days because of the kids, we'll detain the parents separately and place the kids in the care of relatives in this country or in the Department of Health and Human Services custody. And then you have the advocates saying, but you're splitting up families. Well, if these are indeed families, and most of them are, then the kids aren't being trafficked. And we shouldn't be providing them with the special protections that we would afford to true trafficking victims. So we created this straitjacket for ourselves, and we're kind of living with the consequences. Congress could fix this today if they wanted to. They could just fix these two laws, and we wouldn't be dealing with quite the same degree of crisis, and yet they refuse to do that.
And in the meantime, back to Office of Refugee Resettlement, we have got all of these organizations that HHS contracts with, the Bauman Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Tides Foundation, Public Welfare Foundation, it goes on and on and on and on and on. And these people that are running these foundations, these founders and these management people, they're paying themselves $500,000 a year in salaries. And that money, that money, this is RICO as far as I see it. Am I overstating it?
Yeah, that is part of the problem here is that you've got this gravy train going, that anytime somebody comes to the United States and needs to be detained, somebody else is going to get paid. We've created a whole interest group that benefits from the status quo. It might not be working for the country. It might not be good for the people who are being detained, but it sure is good for the people who are providing these services, and they present a very powerful lobby. It's like any other issue. When you have a small group of people or interests that are benefiting significantly from a bad policy, and everybody else is opposed to it, it tends to be that the people who are benefiting directly carry the day. That just seems to be the hallmark of the way things are done in this country, and it kind of explains why we're in the situation we're in, not just on immigration, but a lot of issues.
And then, Ira, we get into these hearings, on the Hill, and you got people like Kamala Harris that think it's absolutely the worst thing that we're doing is that we're fingerprinting, anybody who's necessarily considered an adult or a parent, and they don't want those people fingerprinted then.
Well, they just don't want the law enforced. The Democrats, by and large, have given up any pretense of supporting any kind of immigration enforcement. And it's likely to become even more so after this week's New York primary, where Joe Crowley was defeated by an insurgent who just, wants to abolish ICE. So that seems to be the direction that the Democratic Party is heading in. And quite frankly, it might work in California. It might work in Queens or the Bronx. I'm not sure how well it's going to work for Democrats seeking office in pretty much the rest of the country, but that's their problem. It's not our problem. But the bottom line is that up until a few years ago, the Democrats were at least willing to pretend that they supported some kind of immigration enforcement. Chuck Schumer, back during the days of the Gang of Eight, which was 2013 and 2014, he swore to the American public that that was going to be the toughest immigration enforcement bill ever passed. He was lying through his teeth, but he felt the need to make that statement, at least. Now, the Democratic leadership doesn't even feel the need to lie to the American people anymore. They're just telling us flat out, we're not going to enforce any immigration laws.
And I would say the Republicans haven't crafted a good enough political counter message to say, you're telling us shame on the Republicans, but shame on you because you've offered nothing, right?
Right. The Democrats are at least unified. They have a defined position. The Republicans just can't get out of their own way. The irony here is that they won in 2016. They maintained control of both houses of Congress. They had one of the greatest upsets in a presidential election of all time. And a lot of it was based on their positions on immigration. And, then they just got to Washington and did what they usually do, which is mess it up. And now we're kind of stuck with this. First you had Mitch McConnell in the Senate, who had an attempt to just build a bill on the floor of the Senate, blow up in his face. More recently, just this past week, you had Paul Ryan, who, his compromise bill, he was kind of forced into it by a group of rogue Republicans who wanted to just flat out amnesty. So he came up with this compromise bill, and it went down in flames, 301 to 121. That's got to be an embarrassment. He's leaving Congress. I guess he doesn't care, but it still has to be an embarrassment to the leadership. Well,
probably the most thankless job in government is Speaker of the House, regardless of what party it is. It's kind of like herding cats all the time. And, I'm not defending Paul Ryan by a long stretch, but, he's got the Freedom Caucus, he's got the Congressional Black Caucus, he's got the, Latino caucus, he's got, blue collar, blue Republicans or whatever it is. I mean, the whole thing is a mess. And yet the Goodlatte bill is supposed to be the best bill that we have, but it's got amnesty in it.
Yes. I mean, again, they were kind of forced into this, to have some kind of amnesty. The Goodlatte bill was a very small amnesty, and it was at least delayed until after all the provisions that were promised to the American people went into effect. It wasn't a perfect bill, and that could have passed probably in 2017 when they had the wind in their sails coming off the election. They probably could have passed it in the House. Quite frankly, Chuck Schumer would have blocked it in the Senate, where you need 60 votes. But at least it would have forced the Democratic leadership in the Senate to explain to the American people, well, why are you against border enforcement? Why are you against preventing illegal aliens from taking jobs in the United States? Why are you in favor of allowing local jurisdictions to turn criminal aliens loose on the streets under sanctuary policies that were outlawed more than 20 years ago? Chuck Schumer, as I said, he had the votes to block this in the Senate, but it could have forced him to stand up and say to the American people why he is opposed to all the things that they're in favor of.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Ira Mehlman, who's the media director at Federation for American Immigration Reform. So if FAIR is to write a piece of legislation, what does it look like? Does it include, money for the border wall? Does it include the chain migration thing? Does it include sanctions? Does it include, this cottage business of, refugee resettlement? I mean, what would it? I mean, I would think it'd be 1,000 pages, Ira.
Yeah. I mean, those are two separate things. The immigration reform, the enforcement measures that you just ticked off, yes, it's yes to all of them. It is moving ourselves away on the legal immigration side from a family chain migration system to a system based on individual merit, where anybody from any country ought to be considered based on his or her unique qualifications and what they have to offer to the United States. So that, those would be the sorts of things that we would talk about in terms of reforming immigration policy. The refugee policy, again, I mean, those get back to some of the other things that we talked about, and that probably should be handled separately, because refugee policy and immigration policy really are two separate things. But we really do need an immigration policy, a refugee and asylum policy that recognizes that we're not dealing with the Soviet Union anymore. We're dealing with the crisis of failed states, and that we're going to need to have a policy that allows us some flexibility to manage these current situations, not, situations that disappeared 30 years ago.
I'm a hardliner, and you mentioned merit-based acceptance. My sense is, if somebody applies under merit, meaning they've got a specific skill that the United States is necessarily, in shortage of, which I don't believe, but for the sake of argument, they've got specific skills or specific education that, would enhance something in the United States. I would say, take those skills and keep those skills where they are in Honduras or, Somalia, and let's incubate some kind of economic growth there given those skill sets. Is that like utopia? Am I dreaming?
Well, look, I mean, the United States can continue to take immigrants from these countries. There are a lot of skilled people, a lot of smart people in every country on earth. We're not going to take all of them, but certainly, to the extent that we are going to take immigrants to the United States, they ought to be people who objectively have the most to contribute to the United States. Again, I mean, if we have a reasonable immigration policy with reasonable limits, we are not going to strip the entire world of their skilled work pool. But again, we can kind of quibble about how many people we ought to take. But the United States can and should continue to benefit from some level of immigration, but it ought to be limited and ought to be based on individual merit.
Well, yes. And, people just want to keep coming here. So we have an awful lot of qualifiers, which are, I would say, are entitlements that they want to keep coming here. And yet we have the United Nations and all these other Millennium Challenges and all these other, non-government organizations, USAID, that are throwing money such that we need to take a particular country and make a model out of it. So, I mean, do we go look at, Guatemala or Nicaragua and say, okay, let's model this country. Let's help turn one around, and then we use it as a benchmark for others. I mean, am I still dreaming?
Well, I mean, this kind of hubris to think that we can go fix Guatemala or Honduras or some other country. Okay. We can't even fix the problems here. We can be helpful. We can work with people in those countries who are trying to bring about positive change. As we have demonstrated, nation building isn't really our strong suit. We probably ought to stay away from that sort of thing. What we need to do is to encourage governments to address the needs of their population, not think that they can just ignore them and have them come to the United States and we'll take care of them, and to foster movements within those countries that want to bring about social, political, and economic reforms.
How much of an ear does FAIR, Federation for American Immigration Reform, have with, legislative offices on the Hill?
We have a lot. I mean, we have a government relations department that is up there on a daily basis working with offices on both sides of the Hill, the House and the Senate. So, we're working with the administration. Congress is in gridlock, and, as much as we'd like to think that, we could break that gridlock, it's a bigger problem than that. I mean, you just can't fix these things. And I think everybody is struggling with it. I think Americans are frustrated generally by the fact that you have non-responsive government, that Congress can't seem to get anything done, and, I'm not quite sure how you fix it.
This legislative thing, the Goodlatte bill, or, the ones that, went down in flames within a matter of hours last week, is this a matter of timing, Ira? In other words, we got to get through the midterms and then we kind of visit this whole legislative thing again?
Well, the issue is not going away. Even after the election, this is still going to be an issue. Maybe there will be some fresh faces with some fresh ideas and some willingness to work to solve some of these problems. Right now, it seems that you have members of Congress who are more interested in having a political football to kick around than to actually solve a problem. Maybe they'll come back next January with a new attitude. We can only hope.
Have there been any recent Inspector General reports or investigations on the refugee resettlement component that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of it, but
not either.
These are certainly things that are going to present ongoing challenges, and I assume somebody's going to be looking into it at some point. But, again, getting back to what I said before, a lot of what we're dealing with is self-inflicted. Mm-hmm. If we had rational policies, if we stopped treating every minor who's coming across the border as a potential trafficking victim, if we had a policy that allowed us to keep families together until we could determine whether they have a right to come to the United States or not, we wouldn't have to deal with a lot of these issues. But, as I said, we've created a straitjacket for ourselves, and we refuse to do what's necessary to get out of it.
Ira Mehlman, ladies and gentlemen, who's the media director over at the Federation for American Immigration Reform, who actually is having an event first week in September. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Hold their feet to the fire.
Yeah, it's going to bring together, I think, about 65 radio hosts from around the country. They're all going to be broadcasting from, basically across the street from the Capitol for a couple of days. And, it's a way to get the message home to people around the country. If Congress isn't doing its job, you go over their head and talk directly to the people they work for.
Well, I attended last year. I was one of the radioers, and it was a remarkable event. Great people that you were able to mobilize, and so congratulations, and we wish Hold Their Feet to the Fire 2018 to be as successful, if not more successful, in September. So Ira, well done. Thanks so much for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience, and ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way.
About to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his sitrep.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here in the Denise Simon Experience. Yippee! I have Mark Miller with us, who is the senior and managing attorney for Pacific Legal Foundation down there in hot Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. And very happy that he could be with us because we're going to talk about what everybody else is talking about, and that's Supreme Court, Supreme Court, Supreme Court. And I guess right about now, everybody is working in the Supreme Court to repeal or do away with or declare unconstitutional Roe versus Wade, because that's what the lefts are telling us. Welcome, Mark Miller, to the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you for having me on again, Denise.
What a remarkable term that the Supreme Court actually had, right? I mean, there were some pretty fascinating opinions that came out, and I would say some of the best had to do with free speech. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I would agree with you that it was a banner year at the High Court for free speech issues. They repeatedly came down on protecting the right to think what you want to think, to believe what you want to believe, that the government can't force you to say something that you don't want to say, and that the government can't tell you how to dress, for example, which is a form of speech. That last case I mentioned was called Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Mansky that I'm alluding to. In that case, some Tea Party members who went to vote in Minnesota were initially told they couldn't vote because they were wearing "Don't Tread on Me" shirts. And the poll watcher decided that was too political. And Minnesota had a very vague law on the books that said you can't wear anything political to vote. Not just that you can't wear Hillary for president or Donald for president, but rather anything political in the eye of the jaundiced beholder. And the Supreme Court ruled in a 7-2 decision in a Pacific Legal case, ruled for Pacific Legal, ruled for those Tea Party members up there in Minnesota, and said the government can't have vague laws like that on the books and think they're going to get away with it.
And your client, actually, we discussed this, I think, a week or so ago with another, I think, Wen Fa, one of your lawyers.
Wen wrote
but what is remarkable is your client didn't really want much, maybe $1, but what he really wanted was the law to be written correctly or changed or repealed, correct?
Yes, Denise. As you know, Pacific Legal is a nonprofit, and so we're here. We don't charge our clients anything, and so oftentimes they don't want money either. They recognize they're not paying us. They just want to see the law changed to be more constitutional, to be more liberty-minded, and more interested in freedom. And that's what this case was about. It was about your freedom to wear what you want to wear when you go vote. But it's more than that. Yes, it may sound sort of de minimis or minimal when you hear, well, you get to wear what you want to wear when you vote. But it's about telling the government, back off. You can't try and control us, whether it be what we wear or what we think, which was another case last week that was announced in a 5-4 decision, a closer decision, NIFLA versus Sarah. This was the Crisis Pregnancy Center case out of California.
Oh, yes.
And in that case, as opposed to being told where the government tried to control what you could wear, there the government was trying to control what some pro-life facilities in California were able to say or not say. And they tried to require these facilities to put up signs telling women where to go get an abortion. Now, California would give them a free abortion when these facilities were specifically designed to show women the alternatives to abortion. And they did not want to be telling women where to get abortions. There's plenty of ways to get abortions in California lawfully and plenty of places to go. In fact, California has one of the highest numbers of abortions in the country. So it's not like Californians need to be told where to get an abortion. They know how. They've demonstrated it. The statistics back us up. And but here, the Supreme Court said, yes, you can't make those people say what they don't want to say against their will. Justice Kennedy wrote a powerful concurrence where he said that that's tyrannical, that reminds him of governments that in the past try to control what people think, and that's not what our country's about. That's not what our founding fathers. He actually brings out the founding fathers and said that's not what they thought they were doing when they put the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights.
And I guess in some cases, so much for planning or planned parenthood. I would say that the whole title of the organization fails on the front side because this is what you do when you don't plan.
I certainly think you make a very interesting linguistic point.
I'm being snarky. The other interesting case was the union case. And I particularly liked that one because forcing government employees, whether at the state, city, federal level, to one, join a union and then to pay dues. And in some cases, it may not be a lot, maybe just $600 a year. But you don't get, you are forced to pay that, or were. And then you didn't have any say-so on where those monies were spent, correct?
That's exactly right. And
huge case.
Yeah, in this case, Mark Janis, who was an employee, a government employee in Illinois, he was required by the state to pay, as you said, about $600 to the union, even though he was not a member. The government employee union, even though he was not a member of it, he had to pay them $600. It was taken out of his paycheck. He never got to see the money. And then the union got to do whatever it wanted with it. In theory, the union was supposed to be limited in what it could do with it, but of course that's not how it played out, and the union was giving money to organizations he did not support, Mr. Janis, and he said that violates my freedom of speech. My money is speech. I'm being forced, I'm being compelled to support an organization and then to support other organizations when the union gives it to them that I don't believe in, that I don't support, whether it be a political party or, actually I think in this case Planned Parenthood actually was one of the organizations that was getting funds. And Justice Alito wrote for the majority, again 5-4, said no, that violates the First Amendment, that there had been a Supreme Court precedent from the late 70s that said that was perfectly kosher with the Constitution. And Alito, for a majority of the court, said no, in fact we got it wrong then and we're wrong now, and we're going to rip this one out of the books.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Mark Miller, who is the senior attorney and managing attorney at Pacific Legal. Mark, it's remarkable that Janis case, or that whole kind of union dues thing, was what, 40 years old? I mean, have been traveling around in the legalness for 40 years. Is that right?
Yes, and unions had come to, sort of improperly rely upon it. And the point of Justice Alito's opinion, at least in part, a point he made, is that the unions were taking it for granted. And unions are, if they're there for their employees, should be providing value to an employee such that Mark Janus will want to support the union and then be willingly giving his money to them instead of against his will. And so there's many thinkers who say this will actually be positive for the unions. In the short term, as Justice Alito pointed out, yes, they're going to lose some funding. But in the long term, if they then live up to what unions traditionally were doing, it should be a positive net benefit for the unions.
I'm not convinced of that because, I mean, that's on the front side, it probably gives some unions a little bit more legitimacy, but I'm of the notion that the reasons there were unions launched and born to start with, all of that has necessarily been legislated away, right?
Well, certainly unions, and I'm no historian on the question of unions,
right to work,
but
yeah.
The idea of government unions already gets a bit away, government employee unions gets away from why unions were originally created a century plus ago. And so, and whether or not they made sense 40 years ago when the Supreme Court said it was okay, Justice Alito does a fantastic job of tracing how it does not make sense anymore, that some of the risks that the Supreme Court thought it was avoiding by approving the automatic dunning of money and the compelled dunning of money from these employees did not bear fruit. And in fact, if anything, it was the employees who took the punishment. And so whether or not you agree with the logic that the unions will in fact benefit, they have an opportunity to do so. It's up to the union leaders, who oftentimes the union the blue collar employees or the smaller low level employees who were members of these unions that didn't like what the union leaders were doing with their money. Now the union leaders can try and prove to those employees who refused to join the union that in fact they're going to give them bang for their buck. And if they do that, then it would seem that this is a victory for them in the long term. Even if it's in the short term, it's a step back.
Mm-hmm.
I can hear I don't convince you, Denise, but
well,
that is,
I'm just not a union person. uh-huh. But there are an awful lot of unions out there. I was poking around to see how many there were. I knew obviously a lot of the bigger ones, the SEIUs and the electrical workers and the Teamster, all those. I didn't realize the teachers union. I just didn't realize the volume of quantity of unions themselves, and then how many people were in them. It is really kind of remarkable. So I don't know that we've seen all of the fallout on the Janus case yet. Do you?
I would agree with you that there are organizations that are specifically designed legal organizations that are both specifically designed to protect unions and specifically designed to prove up what you're saying, which is that unions have lost the value they once had and that they should not be given any sort of special privileges, and we'll continue to try and litigate on that question.
It'll be interesting, and I'm getting way ahead of myself on this one, but I am going to watch the NFL Players Union on this one because Richard Trumka does a lot of that collective bargaining for the Players Union. So going forward, it might be interesting to watch in coming months. Now, Pacific Legal did not. The Janus thing wasn't a Pacific Legal client, correct?
Correct. We filed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, supporting Mr. Janus, which we've done in any number of cases. This specific dispute went up to the court repeatedly, and in fact, there was a case in 2016, that Justice Scalia was expected to be the 5-4 vote to give us what happened in Janus. But of course, then he passed, and then the case ended up being tied. So then this Janus case worked its way up, and Justice Gorsuch ended up being the 5th vote in the majority to overturn the Abood decision from the 70s. So it was not ours. I think the group was called Right to Work Foundation.
Yeah.
And excellent attorneys
Mark
over there.
Mix, I think, was his attorney.
Yes, and it's an excellent organization, I believe, based out of D.C., and I know there's at least 1 or 2 former Pacific Legal lawyers who work over there.
How can the 4 justices even begin to have a dissent vote on the Janus case. I mean, it just doesn't compute to me, does it to you? I mean, I don't even see that their argument was good.
Well, I obviously you and I are of like mind on this question. The best argument they could arguably marshal is that the unions had come to rely on that decision, but again, and that reliance factor, or stare decisis, as we say, in terms of the court, in terms of the judges following prior case law. We saw this term repeatedly. The court was willing to overlook stare decisis, or say stare decisis is not controlling. It's not the end of the argument. That if the reasons for the earlier decision that we're now relying upon are no longer sound, that either time has passed or they weren't sound in the first place, well, then we don't just abide by a decision just because we made that decision 40 years ago. If it was wrong then and it's wrong now, then we should overturn it. That's what Alito said. The dissenters, among other reasons, would say, no, there's been a reliance factor here. This is not speech at all. And the court, in its opinion, was getting off track. But I don't see much evidence of that really holding much sway in the future with the way the court is going in terms of free speech. This court more and more is recognizing that so much of what we do as Americans is free expression, and the government can't force us to do things, can't force us to dance to its tune. That if it does that, whether it be with money, when it demands that we pay money to a union that we're not members of, or when it's speech, when it demands in California that we tell people where to go get medical procedures when we're not giving medical procedures, or whether it's in the Minnesota Voters Alliance case when it's going to tell us what we're allowed to wear. This court is saying over and over, no, the government shouldn't be in the business of telling people what it can and can't do when it comes to speech.
All right, I'm going to get snarky. You know that I can do that. College campuses. I just saw a piece today where LSU, Louisiana State University, is only allowing, I think, 2 hours a week for free speech. We know that we have issues at, San Diego State and UCLA, Berkeley, and, Michigan, and several of these others. Mark Miller, why are some of these schools not being legally challenged on free speech?
Well, it depends on if you have the speaker. I mean, Louisiana State obviously is a public institution, and so if there's a speaker there that they don't allow to speak, then I think you will see a lawsuit. It reminds me of what we saw here in Florida last year when Richard Spencer, after he created that tragedy in Charlottesville, then insisted he was going to come speak at the University of Florida, my alma mater. And initially, my alma mater, the president, tried to put him off. But when he made it clear that he was going to try and force his way on the campus accommodated him, but also did so in a way to protect the safety of the students. And having a student there at the time, I was appreciative that they did so. But it cost the school something that upwards of $500,000. And so, you would want someone like Richard Spencer to have to pay that if he's going to, go around the country creating mayhem in the name of whatever white pride nationalism he thinks he believes in, offensive, neo-Nazism. He should be paying it. And I think, in part, you're not seeing more of it because he seems to have gone away.
Faded away, yeah.
Yeah, and so the speakers who do, the more reasonable, legitimate speakers who try to speak, generally appear to be being accommodated, putting aside the our friends in California in the land of fruits and nuts. I know we've seen some issues there, but by and large, speakers have been allowed to speak when they're mainstream conservative or left-wing liberal speakers, and there are organizations that are vigilant. There's a campus organization or a legal organization called FIRE that's very closely watches these college campuses to make sure, particularly the public ones, to make sure they are protecting free speech.
I'm surprised that the Department of Justice hasn't kind of sent out a letter to some of these schools challenging the fact that based on these limitations and these stipulations and conditions that their accreditation could be in question?
Well, first, I'm surprised by many things this current Department of Justice does. But second, that's a more general point. On a second, more specific point, I would say, although I understand and I take your point, I want to remind you that the Obama administration and Department of Education was sending out letters, dear colleague letters, we called them,
I remember,
willy-nilly, trying to make unconstitutional demands on these school officials, and everyone was afraid to challenge them because they were afraid if they didn't follow them, they would get in trouble, even though these letters should not have had the force of law. So although I agree with you, the DOJ should be ensuring that public campuses are observing the First Amendment. At the same time, I'd rather see someone challenge them and then have the DOJ say, that's right, this person should be allowed to speak, rather than a bureaucrat in Washington sending out dear colleague letters and making demands and then the school official having to say, how high do I have to jump?
Yeah, I don't mean demands, but just kind of putting them a little bit on notice. So I understand the
right.
premise.
It's definitely a back and forth, but I will say, on the heels of the previous administration that may have done many things right, but when it comes to these dear colleague letters, I would propose did that wrong. That they were trying to create these letters, trying to imply that they had the force of law, and Washington has very specific rules. We call them the wonks bureaucrats. We call them the Administrative Procedure Act, where if they want to create rules and regulations that effectively have the force of law, they're supposed to come through various formalities. And these letters that just get ripped off and signed, they don't have those formalities, yet the prior administration was trying to act like they had the force of law. And so if the DOJ is now trying to pull back and maybe going too far the other way, better that in terms of liberty than that they follow the prior administration's course of action.
I know, Mr. Mark Miller, you have looked at the Heritage/Federalist Society's list of justices that the presidential candidates had in their arsenal should a jurist on the Supreme Court retire or pass away. And so now we have Kennedy, who has announced his retirement, I think effective the end of July. And so we're going to go for a while. I don't know, when does the court come back into session? September?
Well, officially, the first day of oral argument, we call it the first Monday of October, which is October 1st this year. But technically, they do review cases off and on and motions all summer. They go away on their vacations. Clarence Thomas drives across the country in his RV with his wife, and other justices go and teach classes in Europe and what have you. But they are touching base with D.C., and then in late September they will come back and actually review cases to be heard in October, November, December, and they'll start granting them. But technically, officially, the next term starts October 1.
October 1st. And so we have Kavanaugh, and we've got Barrett, several others. Do you have a particular favorite that you'd like to see there?
Well, there's a law professor from Texas who said you could put a blindfold on him and put the Heritage Federal Society list in front of him and let him throw a dart, and he'd be happy with any of the names that it hit. Mm-hmm. And I think, for the most part, that's probably true. I certainly think Judge Kavanaugh and Judge Barrett would be fantastic additions to the Supreme Court. I'm happy to hear that President Trump is looking at, some people call them constitutionalists or maybe textualists, but people in the mold of Justice Scalia, where they're going to have a way of approaching the law that yields results. The approach yields the result, not the result driving the approach. And that's the problem we get with a living Constitution approach, where you decide what result you want as a judge, and then you find a way to get to it. And I prefer, and I think Pacific Legal prefers, the Scalia approach to interpretation of the law, which is you look at the text of the law, and then there's certain rules of construction, you apply them, and then that gives you your result. And sometimes you might not like the result. The famous case that Scalia didn't like, that's an easy example, is Texas versus Johnson, where Texas tried to make it illegal to burn the American flag, and Scalia, for the majority, along with Justice Kennedy, was with him. They said, in an opinion by Justice Brennan, if I recall correctly, that no, burning the American flag, as much as it offends us, is constitutionally protected speech or expression. It's sending a political message, and Texas, you can't ban that. And so sometimes the result that Scalia landed at, he didn't like, but that's what a proper approach to interpreting the Constitution and interpreting the federal statutes should be. And so President Trump is adhering closely to that kind of model, as we've already seen with Justice Gorsuch, and whether it be Coney or Kavanaugh or any of the other possibilities, it is nice to see that he's following that Scalia mold.
Do we expect sometime soon for Ginsburg to just sort of fade away into history?
Having been at oral arguments a number of times over the last few years, I see no reason, other than her age. I understand why people focus on that, but in terms of her mental acuity, she is on the ball. And whether her voice is soft or loud, whether you agree with her opinions or not, she is right there on the briefs with the oral arguments that are being made by both sides, asking tough questions of both sides. And so, again, other than her age, which I can understand why people would think that means she is closer to the end of her career than the beginning at the Supreme Court, nevertheless, she is very much on the ball. So I would not say that anyone can guess when she might leave the court.
And so with a new composite, with any of those that are on the short list, I mean, the list of 25 down to like 5, I think we are, with any of those that Trump may nominate, where does that necessarily then put Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ginsburg? Do they kind of become real outcasts in all of this?
Well, certainly Justice Kennedy, when President Reagan appointed him, he thought he was appointing a rock-ribbed conservative, and I think Justice Kennedy surprised Reagan and surprised the Republicans who supported him at times. But by and large, he was probably just to the right of center, or occasionally, though, he would swing left. He hated, by the way, being called the swing justice, even though that's what he amounted to the last decade of his career. He said, "I don't swing, the cases swing," in famous quotes. And it was very much sounded like a double entendre. I don't think he meant it that way, but it comes across that way. And I certainly would not suggest he meant it that way. But that was a famous quote when he was interviewed, I think, at Harvard Law a few years ago. And so he didn't like being called the swing justice, but he ended up being the middle, and so now people predict that Chief Justice Roberts will become the middle-of-the-road justice. And if that's the case, well, I think, I haven't done an empirical study, but I suggest if you were to do such a thing, you would see that Roberts probably overall, empirically, is a little bit to the right of Kennedy in terms of results over the career. And so that would suggest the court will move a little bit to the right. At the same time, Chief Justice Roberts has surprised, as we know, it was an infamous Obamacare decision. And so who can predict? They say justices, as they stay longer on the court, drift left. That's another famous term, drift left. We haven't seen much of that with Chief Justice Roberts, but certainly the Obamacare case is an example, perhaps, where he tried to, what he thought was the right thing under the Constitution and uphold the president's power and Congress's power to draft Obamacare and create Obamacare. And it apparently is now failing of its own volition. So,
exactly.
So.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mark Miller, senior attorney and managing attorney at Pacific Legal in the Palm Beach Gardens office. Thanks for your insight and your time today. Very fascinating perspective, and come back again soon.
Anytime. Thanks, Denise, for having me on. Happy 4th of July to you.
You too. Thanks. More coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
You can't handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Distress, Mike Charlie, 4 Tree 5, Niner 2-1, grid to Mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 Tree Niner, 8 Niner, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 53.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We've got the very distinct pleasure of having Nile Gardiner with us, who is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation, and he was a former aide to Margaret Thatcher. We're going to actually speak a little bit about Brexit because I don't think it's getting much play in the news. So, Mr. Nile, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
I think it was last week, and I hope I'm not wrong, that Brexit actually officially became law and was signed off, correct?
Yes.
By the Queen and whatnot?
That is correct, yes. It received the official royal assent. And so Brexit will be, in fact, the official law of the land. This is a very significant development, and so if anyone who doubts that Brexit is going to take place, well, here's the official confirmation of it. And so Brexit is irreversible, unstoppable, and it will be a reality.
What does that really mean now? We know that Britain is leaving the European Union.
Yeah.
But Niall, does that mean so on paper, or are there a lot of? I mean, it's very hard to understand how you have to, detach yourself from a whole operation. I mean, it's got to be a very daunting task.
Well, this is a big task, and so basically Britain will be officially leaving the European Union on the last day of March 2019. So it's not long to go now, actually. It's just really just a few months away. There will, though, be what is expected to be a 2-year transition period following the official British exit. So what the transition means is that a lot of the laws, regulations, etc., that pertain to being part of a member of the European Union will continue for that transition period, in order to allow a sort of I would say graceful transition out of the EU. So Britain, during that period, will in effect remain part of the European Union single market and also customs union, and this will also mean that there will continue to be the free flow of goods, services, people between Britain and the EU during that time frame. At the end of that transition period, of course, Britain will be completely outside of the EU customs union and the single market. So what in effect that means, firstly, with regard to leaving the customs union, is that Britain will be able to sign its own free trade deals, that Britain will be a completely free trading power. Also, being outside of the single market means that Britain can control its own borders and decide who actually comes into the country. At the moment, as a member of the single market, Britain does not have full control over who comes into the country from other European countries. And so, these are very significant developments. It's a very complex process, of course, of Britain to leave the EU, but I am sure, I'm confident that this will be a very successful British exit, and that Britain will be far better off outside of the European Union.
Well, corporations, there's some chatter that they're having some jitters. And I guess that necessarily means with what happens economically, with investments, and with jobs. Is there some truth to that?
Well, I think that Brexit will actually be extremely positive in terms of job creation, in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, and we have seen, of course, for example, major U.S. companies continuing to invest very heavily inside Great Britain. If anything, Brexit will result in even more U.S. investment into the United Kingdom, and so there's no sign that U.S. companies, for example, are withdrawing from the United Kingdom. There's no sign, for example, that European companies are withdrawing from the United Kingdom, and so Britain outside of the EU will continue to be a global economic powerhouse. And in my view, Britain outside the EU will be an even stronger economic player. And let's not forget that when Britain was asked to join the European single currency after the single currency was launched nearly 2 decades ago, Britain, of course, decided to stay outside of the European single currency and not be part of the Eurozone. That actually worked to the benefit of Britain's economy, and it actually resulted in Britain attracting even more foreign investment. So I'm very confident that the United Kingdom is going to flourish and prosper economically outside of the EU.
What role is the European Union leadership playing in all of this? How will this affect the rest of the Union itself?
Well, I think that without a doubt, Brexit is a big game changer. So Brexit is going to, I think, fundamentally reshape the future of Europe, because Britain will not be the only country that will leave the EU. I'm sure that with a successful Brexit, that other European countries will follow Britain's example and actually leave the EU as well. So I think that this is just the beginning, actually, of a very different European Union. Already, I think you've seen significant changes sweeping through the EU since Brexit. You've seen, for example, Eastern and Central European countries standing up to Germany and France, the traditional big powers of the EU. You've seen major debates about migration over immigration policy in Europe. You've seen a growing rejection, I think, of centralized power exerted by Brussels through the European Commission. So I think that Brexit is just the beginning of a very different kind of Europe, and no doubt other European countries will follow Britain's lead once they see that Brexit is a great success.
There was some chatter, obviously, about Scotland, Ireland, and Italy, correct?
Yeah, certainly. I would say that with regard to Italy, you have now a new sort of populist government, which is led by the Five Star Movement and the Northern League. Political parties that have been far more Eurosceptic in their approach compared to the political establishment in Italy, and I think that there's a good chance that Italy, for example, could leave the European single currency in the next few years. Whether it actually leaves the EU or not remains to be seen. I would say that there's growing Euroscepticism in many different countries in Europe, and you're seeing that especially now in Eastern and Central Europe, countries such as Poland, Hungary, for example, the Czech Republic, Slovenia, etc., where publics are starting to turn against the centralizing power of the European Union. We've seen elections recently in Austria, where you've seen more Eurosceptic parties elected. In Germany, you've seen a growing rejection, I think, of the Angela Merkel pro-EU open borders approach, and so all over Europe, I think you're seeing the sort of winds of change are sweeping through.
Indeed so. There are some Brits, there's a segment of the population in Britain that are very positive on Brexit for the sake of sovereignty, but there's some distrust. Where is that coming from?
Well, of course, with the referendum result, it was a very close, closely fought referendum. The Brexit side won about 52% of the vote. The Remain side won 48%, and so you do have a very divided, country in terms of the initial decision to leave the EU. Now, having said that, opinion polls show today that there continues to be a clear majority of Britons in favour of leaving the EU. There's a significant minority who are not in favour of the EU. However, among those Remainers who are opposed to Brexit, there's a significant percentage of those who agree that it's in Britain's interest to get the best possible Brexit deal. So I think there are some pragmatists among the Remainers. But without a doubt, of course, Britain is a divided, country on this issue. But I do think, a clear majority of British people just want to see Britain get on with Brexit, make sure it's a success, and that Britain is able to thrive and prosper outside of the European Union.
Well, what does this have to do with, or what are the implications when it comes to NATO? Can you define that?
Yeah. So basically, of course, the EU is entirely separate from the NATO alliance, and so Britain's decision to leave the EU has no impact upon NATO. And so, the organizations are entirely separate. So the British people did not vote in any way to leave the NATO alliance. Britain remains 100% committed to NATO. And I believe that Britain's role in NATO is actually going to grow even stronger in the Brexit era. And you're already seeing the United States and the United Kingdom working more closely together since Brexit. And the US and the UK will continue to be the backbone of the NATO alliance. So, if anything, I think that NATO will be strengthened as a result of Brexit, not weakened.
And so you think that there will be more robust military power or strength for Britain?
Yeah, I think so. And you're already seeing, increases in British defence spending. You're seeing the launch by Great Britain of two new world-class aircraft carriers.
Saw that.
The first aircraft carrier is already about to go into service. The second will be launched, I think, in 2020. And so, this is a sign that Britain is determined to rebuild its status as a truly global world power. And you have to have aircraft carriers in order to be able to project that power and influence. So, yeah, I do think that you're going to see Britain becoming a stronger military force on the world stage in the Brexit era. You're already seeing Britain becoming increasingly assertive in standing up to Russia. And Brexit Britain is the biggest single opponent for the Russians in Europe today. And you're seeing a strengthening of the US-UK special relationships. So, yes, I think that Britain is only going to grow much stronger in the Brexit era.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Nile Gardiner, who is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. When it comes to Theresa May, she's got. Will it change a parliament in any way? That kind of composition going forward. Do you expect some changes when you go through this 2-year transition period?
Yes, and I should mention actually that the transition period, in fact, does actually end on 31st December 2020. So it's actually a little bit less than 2 years, more like about 21 months actually. But I think that with the present state of the Conservative Party and the British government. Theresa May, of course, has a very, very narrow majority, and that is based, of course, from support from the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, which has a sort of, supply side agreement with the Conservatives to keep the Conservatives in power. It's not a formal coalition, but I would expect to see, that British, government remaining in place through until the end of the transition period. You're going to see, another, general election. I think in 2022, it's possible you could see an election earlier if Theresa May decides to stand down early, or if she is replaced within the Conservative Party. So you could see an earlier general election. But I think that certainly, Theresa May, of course, has every intention of remaining in power right now. If, however, she is seen to be too weak on Brexit, so, for example, if she does not take Britain outside of the customs union, the single market, then I think you could see a rebellion inside the Conservative Party that would force a leadership challenge. But right now, I think that Theresa May remains very much in place as the Prime Minister. We'll have to see what happens over the course of the next few months, and the UK's negotiations with the EU over its post-Brexit arrangement. But I'm confident. I think that Britain will be leaving the single market and the customs union, which will enable Britain to be completely a sovereign, free trading power.
Now, when it comes to laws, I mean, everything necessarily has to revert to the European Union leadership and, one set of laws. And so Britain then, do they kind of revert back to where they were at one point? I mean, I would imagine the whole lawmaking component has to be a daunting task, least of which would be the Schengen, which they didn't really have any kind of attachment to, but they kind of did. So is there going to be some kind of confusion there, or a lot to wade through?
Well, of course, Britain was never a part of the Schengen Agreement, and so the Schengen Agreement, which covers a wide range of countries in Europe today, does not include Britain. Schengen basically allows for the absence of border controls among Schengen member states, and so Britain always declined to be part of that. I think with regard to border controls, you are going to see, of course, border controls firmly in place with regard to Britain's future outside of the European Union. The reality is, of course, that border controls are in place right now with Britain as part of the European Union. However, if you're an EU citizen, you have the right to work in the UK, to reside in the UK. If you're an EU citizen, so the big difference when Britain leaves the EU is that if you're a European Union citizen, you would have to apply for the right to reside and work in the United Kingdom, and on a case-by-case basis, the British government would decide whether you would be eligible to live and work in the UK, depending upon your qualifications, depending upon whether you have a job or not, for example. And so I think that the biggest difference is that you're going to see Britain firmly enforcing its borders within Europe. And that I think will be a very good thing, because I think Britain should have the right to decide who comes into its own borders.
Now, if you were to predict, as a new financial hub or a prevailing financial hub, would London be in competition with some of the other major capital cities within the EU?
Of course, London is already the world's biggest financial center. It's bigger than New York in terms of the amount of money, commodities, etc., that flow through London. And so, if you look at the size of the City of London, the financial center, it is bigger than the financial centers of Frankfurt, Paris, Milan, and Madrid combined. And so there's no question that Britain will not remain in its very privileged status right now as the dominant financial center of Europe. I think that Britain will continue to maintain that dominance. Brexit will not change that. I think Brexit, if anything, will make Britain an even stronger global player. I think you'll see the City of London expanding its dominance actually in the Brexit era, as you've seen in the 2 decades since the European single currency was launched. And so Britain, even though it remained outside of the single currency, maintained its dominance as the biggest financial center of Europe. That dominance will continue outside of the EU.
It's still a very daunting task, all of it, to put all these pieces together. I mean, it's almost like a chessboard, is it not?
Yeah, it is. It is a chessboard, and I think you're dealing, of course, with a European Union that is keen in many ways to punish Britain for Brexit in order to warn other European countries against going down the same path. So I think there's a lot of unpleasantness and nastiness coming from the European Commission in Brussels. But the reality is the British people have voted to leave the EU. They wish to be a free sovereign nation, and there's nothing that the EU can do about it. Despite any sort of unpleasantness coming from Brussels, Britain is going to become a free sovereign nation, and that's the reality.
Well, I think for a lot of other capital cities, the Frankfurts and the Milans and Dublins, there's a lot of, and even for the United States, there's a lot of lessons to be learned, not just in Western allies, but maybe even when it comes to the United States with the NAFTA thing, and even in Latin America. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are important lessons here. I think, the first important lesson is that, sovereignty, self-determination really matters. And Brexit is all about taking back control. It's all about national sovereignty and self-determination. I think, secondly, borders matter as well. And Brexit was in part, a decision by the British people to defend Britain's borders and prevent, a sort of open borders sort of approach. And every nation has the right to defend its own borders, and that's a big part of Brexit. I think that has important lessons for the United States as well. It's also about, Brexit is about free trade, about economic freedom, and Britain is going to return to being a great free trading nation outside of the EU, and I think that's another important lesson.
I tip to you, Mr. Nile Gardiner, the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center of Freedom and Heritage Foundation. We appreciate your presentation and your good explanation, and thanks so much for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
We're coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
You are about to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Very happy that you could join us. We have reached all the way to Ukraine for the last segment of our show, and I've got the distinct pleasure of having Nolan Peterson with us. I've followed his work for a long time. He's actually been on the show, I think, 2 or 3 other times, but it's been quite a while. Nolan is a graduate of the Air Force Academy. He was a Special Forces pilot, and since leaving the military, he's gone on to be a foreign war correspondent, actually doing an awful lot of traveling, but he's reported on Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, several other places, and he's also got some other big news that has just happened to him as well. So with that, Nolan, welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
First, let's start. Since you're in Ukraine, give us the status, if you would, on this Ukraine conflict.
Well, the war is basically locked in the same condition it's been in since the February 2015 ceasefire was signed, which is it's a static trench war with daily artillery shots, tank shots, rocket attacks, almost always coming from the combined Russian separatist side, attacking the Ukrainian positions. It's a static conflict, though. Neither side is trying to take any ground. So when you are out there and you see the war going on, it's just beyond absurd, because neither side is actually trying to accomplish anything other than to just not leave the front lines. But for Russia, they have a way to kind of twist the dagger in Ukraine's side to slow down Ukraine's pivot to the West, which is what the Ukrainian Revolution was all about in 2014, was the country wanted to turn away from Russia and become a part of Europe and the West. And so Russia tried to prevent that from happening by interfering with Ukraine's political evolution, democratic evolution through the war. So we're stuck pretty much in the same condition we've been in now for 4 years.
Now, what help is the United States finally giving Ukraine, if any?
Well, we are delivering the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which is a huge, mainly symbolic step for Ukraine. They've really been anticipating some support from the United States for a long time. And the fact that President Trump, to his credit, something President Obama never followed through on. But President Trump approved the delivery of lethal weapons to Ukraine, which Ukraine is one of the world's top weapons exporting countries. So at the end of the day, Ukraine doesn't really need the weapons, but it sends a very, very loud message to both the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian soldiers, as well as to Russia, that the United States is willing to at least invest the delivery of lethal weapons to this conflict. And so I think for the Ukrainians, it's a huge morale booster. And I think it's certainly raised eyebrows in Russia that the United States is digging its heels in support of Ukraine as far as this conflict goes.
I'm sure you know here at this point that President Trump is meeting with Putin in Helsinki. What do you anticipate? Do you anticipate Ukraine and being brought up as a topic?
Absolutely. I think, Crimea obviously is the elephant in the room whenever Russia is discussed. I think for Putin, his domestic popularity really got a jolt when Russia invaded and seized Crimea back in 2014. So for Putin, it's a non-starter to suggest the prospect of giving Crimea back to Ukraine. But also for the United States or any Western country to acknowledge that Crimea officially belongs to Russia is to send a pretty it's a pretty strong statement against the democratic world order that has pretty much prevented another world war since World War II. Russia seized territory through an invasion in 2014 in Europe, and I think there is some fatigue now, 4 years later, that the EU has been maintaining sanctions against Russia to their credit because it has hurt their economies to do that. But I think now, we are starting to see a little bit of fatigue and a little bit of that the shock of the Crimean invasion is wearing off, and there are other problems around the world, and I think the greatest fear for the Ukrainian politicians, is that somehow the West will trade a concession in Ukraine for Russia's help in another theater, such as Syria, obviously, and that's been a long time worry of the Ukrainians, and so we'll see.
What is a Russian separatist?
Well, in the war zone in Ukraine, which is only about 5% of the country, by the way, in Kyiv, you can walk around and it looks like a summer day in any European capital. It's the overwhelming majority of the country is peaceful and people are going about their normal lives. But in the war zone in the Donbass, within there's two separatist territories which Russia controls, both through command and control of their military and also financially. And fighting for these separatist territories are pro-Russian Ukrainians who have joined a separatist movement, but also within that force there are Russian regular soldiers as well as foreign mercenaries, including many from Chechnya. Yes, we've seen them out there. Actually, it's quite bizarre because there are Chechens fighting on both sides of the front lines. The ones who have resentment toward Russia from the Chechen wars. Then also there are the Chechens who fight on Russia's behalf out there as well. But the overall force, I call them the combined Russian separatist forces. It's about 30,000 separatists, roughly 3,000 Russian regulars, and then other foreign mercenaries mixed in the pot. On the other side of the front lines, there are tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers rotated in and out of the war zone. So it's a war. It's obviously it pales in comparison to Syria as far as the death toll. There's about 10,300 dead in the Ukraine war versus hundreds of thousands, 500,000 dead in Syria. But I think it's important to remember that there is a shooting artillery trench war going on in Europe right now, and the potential for that war to to escalate unintentionally from both sides into something much worse is always there, and it's always hanging over Europe. And I think that although the war is often forgotten by Western media, I think, as we've seen with Russia's aggressive behavior over the last 4 years, we ignore Russia and Ukraine at our peril, because Russia will continue its conflict with the West until we put our foot down at some place and stop it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it appears that some Eastern European countries are, I guess, finding themselves wanting to be more robust in a defensive and even offensive posture against Russia, correct?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the great untold stories of our time over the last 4 years, is the very rapid militarization of Eastern Europe due to the Russian threat as they perceive it to be after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania actually have percentage-wise, the fastest increasing military budgets of any other countries in the world. And Poland as well has massively built up its military defense spending since 2014. And I've had the opportunity to travel quite a bit in that region, particularly the Baltics. And they, both politicians, soldiers, and the average civilian on the street, they take very seriously the possibility that Russia could invade their countries. And I think that's something that's hard for most Americans to understand. When we think about tank invasions as something that belongs in a World War II movie, not something that could happen next week. And that's a war, by the way. Those are NATO countries, and if Russia attacks them, America is going to be pulled into that conflict. And so I think there are, I think that is a vastly underreported story, but one that I have to admit, it kind of sends a chill down my spine when I think about what that kind of war would actually look like.
The United States has given those countries some help too under Operation Atlantic Resolve, right?
Correct. Yes, NATO has 4 rotating battle groups throughout the Baltics, about 1,000 troops apiece, which aren't enough, obviously, to repel a Russian invasion, but they are enough to send a pretty strong deterrent message to Moscow. But there's a constant drumbeat of military exercises in the Baltics and in Poland. We've almost always got some sort of U.S. warplanes flying around to demonstrate our resolve to defend the airspace. This summer, I had the opportunity to visit 2 NATO exercises, both which were led by the U.S. One which is exclusively special operations, the other one was a conventional forces exercise called Saber Strike. But just, we are definitely there. We are showing Russia that we're serious about defending that territory. But it's, one thing that really struck me in my visit this summer was the fact that, the Baltic states have rather small militaries, obviously compared to Russia's, and their national defense plans are to mobilize every man and woman in the country to wage a resistance war should Russia invade. So it's, they're sending, military field manuals to citizens to prepare them to wage basically a resistance partisan war should Russia invade. So it's pretty eye-opening, and I think that the seriousness with which they perceive the Russian threat in the Baltics is just something that doesn't get back to America. It gets lost in the news cycle, and I think that's a disservice.
Moscow's still very much in denial that these activities are happening, correct?
Yes. Well, in general, they're the go-to tactic of Moscow is to deny. But I think, it's even as a journalist, right? There's the old expression in journalism, which is the blind man and the elephant. If you're one blind man, you touch an elephant, you don't really know what you're looking at. And that goes for me when I go to the war zone in eastern Ukraine and I see artillery or tanks shooting. I don't know if it's a Russian soldier in that tank or a separatist or, or some coal miner who just found a tank, as Russia claims. But you can make some pretty, logical deductions. Like, for example, you can't go to a grocery store in the Donbass in East Ukraine and buy a tank or buy a bazooka or buy a rocket. So those weapons have to come from somewhere. Russia will. They're the masters at taking a seed of doubt and turning it into a completely false narrative. And I think we've seen that, for example, in the Skripal case in the United Kingdom, the nerve agent attack in the United Kingdom. In the weeks that followed, there were dozens of alternative stories that were presented from the Russian side. And,
Yes.
I think their intention isn't to necessarily convince you of another version, but it's just to muddy the waters to the point that the average news consumer doesn't even know what to believe any longer. And so you just kind of tune out. And I think, we're seeing the effects of that now, where I think a lot of people just don't know what to believe anymore.
And Putin yet could call off all of this conflict in Ukraine anytime and refuses.
Absolutely, yes. The war ends the instant that Russia decides that it's no longer in its interest to fight there. Like I said, Russia presents it as a civil war fought by separatists, but in reality, all the weapons, all the money, the command and control, the commanding officers, it's all from Russia. Mm-hmm. So the minute that dries up, the minute that ends, the war ends. There's a saying that's quite popular among the Ukrainian soldiers, which is, if we turn around and go home, Russia will invade behind us. Whereas if the Russians turn around and go home, the war ends. So the war is 100% dependent on Russia's will to continue it.
Lots of lessons to be learned, I think, with what is happening in Ukraine on the tactics of Moscow. And I don't think, like you said, nearly enough attention is being paid to any component of that. All right, well, let's talk about some good news. And that is that you are now a published author.
I am.
Yes, congratulations. And your book title is Snowblind. Which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, can be found over at Amazon.com. So congratulations with that. And the book is nonfiction, but I have a sense there's a lot. I mean, it's fiction, but there's a lot of nonfiction in there. Did I get some of that right?
Yeah, it's a collection of fiction short stories, which is kind of a leap of faith on my part, being a journalist, to move in that direction. But of course, I think I've had quite a fortunate life as both a pilot for Air Force Special Operations and having been a war correspondent for the last 5 years, that I've seen a lot in my life, and I've met a lot of very interesting people. And I think fiction allows me as a writer to combine those experiences in a way that writing nonfiction just couldn't do. And so I'm able to, I'm 36 now, and I feel like I'm at a point in life where I've got some mileage in my life, and I've experienced some things.
You're talking to somebody that's son older than you, but go ahead.
But yeah, so I feel like I've got some stories to tell, and I was really excited. I think writing fiction, I've always loved Hemingway's work, and I think, there is something about, being somebody who's been in war, both as a combatant and as a witness, as an observer. And, I felt the urge to write, and I felt the urge to tell these stories and to convey sort of the changed way in which I view the world due to my life experiences.
Nolan, I would say that you'd almost had to have kept some kind of a journal in order to build these stories. So what was that like to kind of go back and revisit some of the previous days in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's one story in the collection called Win or Lose, which is about a combat mission and combat special operations aircraft mission over Afghanistan. So of course I drew heavily on my own experiences. It's not a biographical account, but it is based on what I experienced firsthand. But yes, when I was in war, I kept a journal every day because I know that so much of what we experience in those pivotal moments in life is lost. And so it's really important to keep track of those memories. But a lot of the characters in the story, like the title story, Snowblind, takes place in the Himalayas. And one of the characters in the story is a Tibetan freedom fighter who was a part of the Chushigandruk, which is this Tibetan freedom fighter army that the CIA trained in the 1960s and 70s to fight against communist China. Well, as a journalist, I spent several months hiking through the Himalayas looking for these Tibetan freedom fighters, and I found quite a few of them, and I did a series of interviews and spent a lot of time getting to know them. So, of course, it was those real experiences which allowed me to craft those characters and to tell, at least from what I hope to be, some really powerful stories. But, the fiction is not a retelling of my own life. But it's sort of a silly metaphor, perhaps. But I kind of equate it to like Legos. You can each memory of my life is like a Lego block, but you can construct them in different ways to tell different stories. And so I think that's what I've done with my life experiences to create these fiction stories.
Well, Nolan, would almost appear that your book should be read by people on an awful lot of continents, right?
I would hope so. Yeah, I think for particularly for the American audience, I think that it's we are so disconnected from war in America geographically, and we are so eternally lucky. And I've been living in Ukraine now for 4 years. I live in a country where there is an actual war just a train ride away. And I think we forget sometimes in America that war, except for September 11th, 2001, in my lifetime, it never touches us in our day-to-day lives. And so I think to really understand the experiences of our veterans, to understand the experiences of people around the world who are dealing with war, it's important to not just read the news every day, but also to kind of get into the mindset of people who have been through these things. And so I hope that these fiction stories can allow people back home to connect with the wars in Afghanistan or in Ukraine a little more deeply than they could otherwise by just reading the news.
Well, I mean, if you go from Tibetan freedom fighters to Afghanistan to Ukraine, the landscape of that battlefield is very different, correct?
That's a great point. But I even wrote an article about this a few years ago, comparing the Tibetan freedom fighters to the Ukrainians, and then the Kurds. I embedded with the Kurdish Peshmerga in Iraq, and it's incredible the common sentences you hear from these soldiers, including obviously the American troops I've seen in combat as well, and you realize how common the inspiration for young men and women to go to war is, and how they truly represent something. They are responding to the most evil part of humanity, but in responding to that, they are leaning on the very best qualities that humans could possibly have, which is self-sacrifice and to stand for something good and to push back against evil. And I've seen that amongst Tibetan freedom fighters and Ukrainians and Americans and the Kurds. And I think there is something universal about good people who go to war for the right reasons. And I think, throughout these stories, I think, the reader would be heartened to know that there are such common through lines of goodness in humanity too, even in an environment as dark as war.
Well, those that are in the military, regardless of what position they have, and they're called to service, and they willingly go to the conflict, essentially we're trying to get some equilibrium back, and we see the evil, we're trying to clean up the mess. And that objective sometimes is quite fleeting, right?
Yeah, I think it is. A metaphor I've used in some of my journalism actually is that the importance of what our military, in particular United States military, does around the world. It's like treading water. Mm-hmm. The minute you stop kicking, you sink. And I think the minute we stop thinking that the world needs us, evil will take. I mean, I don't want to get too apocalyptic here, but I think you start to see, and I think I obviously not to make this political, but I think during the tail end of the Obama presidency, we did see some instances such as the red line in Syria and the United States standing on the sidelines as Russia invaded Crimea. And I think the fact that America didn't push back more strongly against those aberrations in the world order, those violations of the world order, I think it emboldened countries like Russia to be more aggressive throughout Eastern Europe. It emboldened, it emboldened Iran. It emboldened China to start, building military bases out of coral reefs in the South China Sea. Mm-hmm. And so I think we forget sometimes that, the United States military in our country in general, it really is in some ways the glue that holds world peace together. Yes. And I think it's easy to forget that when we get so used to our lives, our good lives in America, and we forget that the American life is not the consensus human experience around the world.
Boy, that's indeed right. Nolan, congratulations on the book, Snowblind. And ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to visit the Daily Signal because a lot of Nolan's work is there, and I know that even Newsweek has picked up your work. Yep. And, with press written across your chest, I would say that you've got the ability to not only be a previous warfighter yourself, but you have a very unique perspective in all of this. And your reporting is very important because it is kind of a forgotten region. That I think you're the only one that is doing this reporting. We're not hearing it from anybody else. So the burden's on your shoulders, Nolan, and I think you're up to the task. So far, I've seen that to be true. And thanks for your service, for sure. And
thank you. Appreciate that.
The book, again, ladies and gentlemen, is Snowblind and Other Stories, certainly found over at Amazon.com. And how long did it take you to write the book, Nolan?
About a year. Hey. I think, it took me just about 2 months to write the stories, and then this being my debut fiction experience, I just edited. So hopefully the next one will be a little quicker.
All right. Well, I'm sure there are more in your future. So congratulations again, and stay safe over there. Come home soon, and thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.